Welcome, everyone, to the Revolution 250 podcast. I'm Bob Allison. I chair the Rev 250 Coordinating Committee, and Rev 250 is a consortium of about 70 organizations in and around Massachusetts looking at commemorations of the American Revolution. And I'm delighted to have with us today someone from one of our partner organizations, the Adams National Historical Park in Quincy, Massachusetts, Kelly Cobble, who is the curator at the Adams National Park. Thanks for joining us, Kelly.
Happy to be with you.
Great. So what are let me ask you, I know you are a curator, but you also do show people what's in the houses. So what's your favorite thing to show people when they come to Quincy?
Ooh, Bob, that's one of those tough questions, of course. Okay. I do have a favorite object, I hate to admit. And it is in the old house, and it is a memorial wreath that was presented to Louisa Catherine Adams, John Quincy Adams's wife. And it was handmade by female students at a Moravian school down in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. And it is a beautiful hand-sewn silk wreath with a red, white, and blue floral circle. And within the circle, it does say presented to Louisa Catherine Adams, First Lady or a Lady of the President, but it's honoring John Adams's death. So it has July 4th, 1826, hence the red, white, and blue color of the wreath made. And it's really an incredible piece, just for the artwork and the craft of it. But also, I love it because it does represent our father and son presidents. And of course, for so long, we had that glory. But it also represents the women of the family. Because it was presented to Louisa Catherine, we would be remiss to ever take people through and not highlight the women that made up the Adams family. So.
There were extraordinary women in the Adams family. We know a lot about Abigail, but Louisa Catherine is a fascinating person in her own right. You tell her story a bit at the house.
Yes. She really, none of the Adamses come to any of the story easy. And so Louisa was a beautiful woman, well educated and prepared by her American merchant father and British mother in London. And so they grew up, on the fringes of the social status in the courts of London. And so she was well versed in music and the arts and well read and adored poetry. And they were a large family of 6 or 7 women and a son. And so they would perform theatrical arrangements in the home and so on and so forth. So love to have a good time, love to entertain. And so John Quincy Adams actually met her when he was very young on his first trip over to Europe with his father, as John was very well acquainted with Josiah Johnson. And so but later in John Quincy's life, when he was actually on his own diplomatic mission, he went to the Johnson home for his entertainment and was smitten with Louisa Catherine. And eventually they did marry. And of course, Abigail and John were back here in the United States at the time. And, we do like to tell the story that John Quincy had also had another relationship that was thwarted by his mother because he wasn't quite ready yet. So I love the correspondence that John and Abigail find out in a letter that he was married in London with his brother as a witness. And that was it. He wasn't taking any chances of doing that again.
Mother,
So, but she was a very courageous and talented woman. And again, one of the greatest stories that we like to tell about her is her 40-day journey from St. Petersburg to Paris, where John Quincy Adams had just finished negotiating the Treaty of Ghent. And he said, close up the home, and you and young Charles Francis Adams come meet me in Paris, just like
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's not like they could get on a plane. She
No,
has to hire a carriage, and this is just after Napoleon's army has been chased
absolutely.
across Europe. So Europe's been torn apart by this war, and here she
Very
is in this.
violent and
Yeah.
vulnerable and frozen tundra,
Yeah.
no
Yeah.
less. She
Yeah.
had to travel all through Eastern Europe and down
Mm,
along through the European wasteland,
mm,
really, at that point. So, yes, very courageous and
yeah.
no good living conditions, had to stop at these
Hmm.
taverns on the side of the road, and there was all
Yeah.
kinds of espionage and,
Mm,
people look and at one
yeah.
point, she was sleeping with, any type of, money,
Mm, yeah.
with her, and it
Yeah.
was never safe. It was really
No. Yeah. Yeah.
challenging.
Wow. So she does it. Now, she doesn't really get along that well with her mother-in-law, but she and her father-in-law have a kind of an interesting close relationship.
Absolutely. Well, Abigail did come to
Yeah.
appreciate Louisa. Of course, she just was very concerned that,
Hmm.
what were people going to think? He was bringing back this, quote, British woman,
Hmm. Yeah.
she was afraid that she might be, not of the ilk of a Yankee,
Yeah.
New England woman stock.
Hmm.
So she was always concerned that Louisa might be too fragile and
Hmm.
too needy, but she
Hmm.
turned out to be the complete opposite, was
Hmm.
very capable, and she got politics, and she
Oh,
was
yeah.
very helpful to John Quincy Adams, throughout all of his career.
Hmm.
She was the darling, graceful, one who would make the small talk, who could speak
Hmm.
French fluently, who could entertain all of the men, at the table,
Hmm.
and while John Quincy Adams was putting them off
Yes. Yeah.
and almost repulsive.
Yeah.
So, she did prove herself quite worthy, and
Hmm.
Abigail, definitely paid attention to that.
Yeah. Yeah.
So they became quite close,
Hmm. Yeah.
eventually, and Louisa did, respect her.
Hmm.
But yes,
Yeah.
Louisa and John Adams did also know right from the start that they
Hmm.
each had a mind to
Yes.
to be, valued.
Oh, yes. It's one of the great things about the Adams site. You tell the story of these generations who lived there over the course of well over 100 years. But also, you mentioned that you're in the old house, but then there are two other houses that are part of the site.
Exactly. And so when you asked me, what's my favorite thing, that's why I was torn, because the birthplace homes is actually my favorite part of the story.
Mm. Yeah.
And so we have the less amount of stuff. We do have the original foundations. We do have the
Hmm.
original buildings, if you will, but they did have a complete restoration in the 1980s when they came to the Park Service from the family and from the city of Quincy.
Hmm.
And they had left the family at late 19th century when Charles Francis Adams, sold off a lot of the land around them, and but the city did preserve them and
Hmm.
show them for almost 100 years. And when they became too much for them to handle, they did approach us with the Park Service, and we were thrilled because now we
Hmm.
can tell really the birth to death story
Oh, yeah.
of both presidents and the wives.
Hmm.
So we have a small acre of land that have these two humble salt box cottages, but I like to say the stories that come out of it, the courage that came out of those two places is really incredible. And
Hmm.
that has been really our theme of the year. Actually, we just opened up last week. Hooray!
Great.
The birthplaces only. So we can take people through for
Hmm.
small ranger led
Mm.
walkthroughs, really, of the humble cottages.
Mm.
And we tell the story of Abigail's story,
Hmm.
significantly, is down there. She was alone so much of the time. It's where
Hmm.
John Adams is catapulted into public service, where his character is formed throughout his father's influence and his
Hmm.
mother's influence and the church and, the
Hmm.
involvement that his family had. So we just love being able to tell the story really of the American Revolution right there in a little
Hmm.
postage stamp of uh, of land, but very important, very
It
important.
really is. And it's really being in this small space. I remember being on a ranger tour once and said that this is the room where John Adams learned how to read. And you just think about that moment and what that means. And then there was
Absolutely.
a church, a
Yes.
deacon was, there was a trial for a pastor in the back
Mhm.
room, and he gets a sense of politics and why the church maybe isn't the career he should follow. And
Absolutely, absolutely.
yeah,
Yeah, so it's I love it.
mm,
Even again, even while we've been closed for a year, people would call and I would say, "Still, go down there. Go look and
hmm,
you can't
yeah,
really peek in the windows, but, look at these cottages and
hmm,
know that these men came from planting potatoes, one minute
hmm.
to, both becoming presidents of the
Oh,
United
that's right.
States,
Yeah.
traveling across the country, and then,
Mm-hmm.
of course, John Quincy Adams traveling to St. Petersburg when he's only
Mm-hmm.
14. I mean,
Mm,
again, I think the word courage and
yeah.
education, are
Hmm.
really the 2 key components that we have that come out of
Yeah.
those
Yeah.
humble cottages.
Yes. And then as John Adams becomes the American minister to London, and he remembers the grand house, the vassal house that he determines to buy. So he buys it when he
Right.
comes back, which is, I think, where you are now. So what's the old house? Can you tell us about it? It's a special
Sure.
place.
Well, I'm actually in the Beale House, which
Oh,
is
okay.
a property adjacent to the old house,
Hmm.
and actually John Adams was writing to his daughter in 1792, watching the most handsome house, in town be built,
Ah.
and, Captain Benjamin Beale was a good friend of John's, and he moved from a different part of town, a more isolated,
Hmm.
part with a large farm out in Squantum, but he wanted to be closer to the downtown because Benjamin Beale was actually, um, very influential in breaking, um, Braintree away from Boston and
Hmm.
eventually what became Quincy. So he
Hmm.
needed to be a little bit closer to where the action was.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
And, and then so right next to it is, as we call it, the old house at Peacefield, because
Hmm.
John Adams did, move in 1788 on his return from Europe and, was fully convinced that he would just retire from this horrible public life that he had
Hmm.
lived
It's
and
been about 20
and
years when he had been in politics at that time.
exactly, and just retreat back to being a farmer, which is what he always wanted, as we know.
Hmm.
And, so as he was, wrestling with the bricks and the stones, because he also called it Stonyfield, um, he did get the call, of course, to be, uh, George Washington's vice president
Right.
as well as president of the United States from the Peacefield property.
Mm.
And it was later in life that he did christen it Peacefield, and it was because of the efforts that he made, A, in negotiating the ultimate peace treaty with Great Britain that ended the Revolutionary War, but also that the hard work that kept him out of war with
Hmm.
France during his presidency, which he was very proud of, and of course might have cost him his presidency
Right. Yes.
in the eyes of many others. But,
Right.
I am so, honored that we get to work with in a place that,
Hmm.
where one person's efforts for
Hmm.
peace and success for this country
Hmm.
can
Yes.
endure.
So we've been talking with Kelly Cobble, who is a curator at the Adams National Historical Site in Quincy, Massachusetts. And another of the great things, well, you also have, of course, the room at Peacefield where on July 4th, 1826, John Adams died, which is a phenomenal thing to think about. 50 years after the great moment in July
Mhm.
4th of 1776, he and Jefferson both die on the same day. And you have the chair, I think, where he was sitting, and it's in his 90s,
Well,
maybe.
you know historic houses and the myths that come with them, but the old house is filled with all original objects, which is
Hmm.
really a phenomenal thing. All original to 4 generations. So we don't have any period rooms. You can't walk through there and know that you walked through a room where John and Abigail were having tea.
Hmm.
But but those are the rooms where they were having tea. But so you'll see 17th as well as 19th century furniture
Hmm.
um, among each and
Yeah.
every room, and that's how their great grandson Brooks Adams arranged the house to be shown. So
Hmm.
he was aware of it. He wanted it to be
Hmm.
a historic house museum,
Hmm.
and he was very well aware of the Mount Vernon Ladies Association
Right.
and the preserving of the significant properties that weren't always being
Hmm.
preserved at that time. So he held on to the old house and arranged it as it was. And like you said, in the study, you see Henry Adams's desk front and center,
Hmm.
but you also see 18th century, the desk that John Adams did have in Europe with
Hmm.
him when he was negotiating the peace treaty, and also chairs and furniture that he used both in Europe and here in the
Hmm.
United States. We believe that because it's on the east side of the house, that it was more cooler in the summer
Hmm.
than his bedroom on the west side, and
Hmm.
so he would did have a bed in there, and he was surrounded by his family. They were
Hmm.
reading to him. He was still dictating letters, and
Hmm.
he's surrounded by adoring grandchildren and nieces that they had taken in with them to live there. At one point, there were 14 people living
Hmm.
in the Adams home with John and Abigail in their later lives. And but on the 4th of July, of course, he was less conscious than
Hmm.
more. And but when the family did surround him, and people were saying, talking about it being the 4th of July, even though John, we know, celebrated on the 2nd. um, among his last words were, Jefferson still survives. But of course,
Hmm.
we know that Jefferson did not survive as long as
Yes.
John Adams.
Yeah, he had died about 1 in the afternoon,
Hmm.
and then
Hmm.
John Quincy was president at the time, and he heard his father was failing, so he's on his way
Right.
back to Quincy, and he gets the
Absolutely.
message as he's on the road that from Virginia that Jefferson had died. He thinks, what a astonishing thing that Jefferson dies on July 4th, and then when he gets, I think, to Philadelphia or New York, news comes from
Hmm.
the north that his father also had died in the same day, and he sees this as real sign of providence.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely, and we do have one of the most beautiful quotes that when he does eventually reach Quincy, probably I don't know 5, maybe I
Mm-hmm.
think it was 4 or 5 days later, um, and when he does step into the study room that we're
Mm-hmm.
referring to, he does say, it's like an arrow stricken his heart, and
Mm-hmm.
he recognizes he's lost both his parents, and this is
Mm-hmm.
his place of birth, really, meaning
Mm-hmm.
Quincy, or the
Yeah.
town at the time. And he then struggles with what is he going to do with all of this
Right.
stuff and with the property. It's still a working farm at the
Mm-hmm.
time, and he's most of his life is in Washington,
Mm-hmm.
and he does actually appoint his youngest son, Charles Francis Adams, to
Mm-hmm.
be the caretaker of all of the property, including the birthplaces and the old house. And that really becomes Charles Francis's
Mm-hmm.
full-time
Right.
study. But then
Yes.
again, he becomes, and what I think is also one of the most astonishing stories, he becomes the third generation of Adams men to be um, appointed ambassador to Great Britain. So
Right.
starts with, I think, one of the most courageous elements of our American history,
Mm-hmm.
and that is John Adams
Mm-hmm.
standing in front of the king who he was, born a British subject.
Yes.
He was born under the king's
Mm-hmm.
rule when he was born, and
Mm-hmm.
struggled to maintain, our independence because of
Mm-hmm.
what was being done
Oh
to the
yeah.
colonies. He
Mm-hmm.
probably, never would have seen him in that light, but
Right.
because of the incidences
Mm-hmm.
along the way.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yes.
I think it's an amazing,
Really
amazing
is.
time. And then, of course,
Really is.
Charles Francis Adams has to keep British neutral during the
Right.
Civil War under Lincoln.
Right.
So
Yes.
again, the
Mm.
strength that come from these men in the
Oh
family
yes.
is really
Yeah.
incredible.
Yeah. Now, Charles Francis also does something that John Quincy had wanted done, which is to get the books out of the house. He and his father both had extensive libraries and were
Sure.
packed into the house. So it's hard to imagine the house now with all of the books. So can you tell us a bit about the Stone Library?
Absolutely. Well, of course, during John Adams and John Quincy Adams's time, they were actually held in an old decrepit farmhouse out in
Mm,
back of the house.
mm,
And so John Quincy Adams did have shelves built lining the study walls and
mm,
had most of his books installed into the study. But
mm.
he even wrote during his lifetime that he still had trunks and trunks of books that never were opened,
Mm.
unfortunately. But we'll never underestimate how much both those men read for
Well,
sure.
yes. Mm,
And so the books did move from the farmhouse into the study, and then yes, unfortunately, John Quincy Adams didn't live to see it happen, but Charles Francis Adams did build a stone library, which we think really is the monument to the family and the
hmm.
legacy of the Adamses. And so we have about 12,000 volumes of books,
Mm,
and they belong to about half of them belong to John Quincy Adams, and the others all belong to a combination of the generations. Some
well,
of
yeah.
John Adams's books are there, the ones that he left to his family, and Charles Francis Adams has books there, most of his
Hmm.
collection, and then some of Henry Adams's, and then some of the other fourth generation
Yeah.
Adamses. But from that point on, the books do get scattered. I know the
Hmm.
Boston Athenaeum has some. Massachusetts Historical
Yes.
Society has a significant amount of
Yeah.
Henry's books,
And the
and of course the
BPL
Boston
also.
Public Library has John
Yeah.
Adams's books. So,
Right.
um, so that was kind of my hook
Mm,
when I
yeah.
came here a long time ago,
Hmm.
and my job as a museum technician was to dust and clean the books of the
Wow.
library.
Wow.
And I can't tell you. Well, obviously, it's been a long time that
Hmm.
I've still maintained this position, so,
Hmm.
it's still one of my favorite things to
Great.
do, and,
Great.
the stories that those books can
Oh,
tell and the
yeah.
stories that, have come through the park are really
Hmm.
amazing.
Yes. We're talking with Kelly Cobble, the curator at the Adams National Historical Site, Quincy. And did I know John Adams wrote a lot in his books? Did John Quincy and the others also make notes? No.
No, yes, John is famous for his marginalia, which is so terrific to read. No, John Quincy didn't write like John Adams, but he did have some kind of codes.
Mm-hmm.
There's you know, dash marks or plus signs, etc. So there's some kind of little coding that does go on, but not a lot of it.
Mm-hmm.
Ch George Washington Adams, John Quincy's eldest son, actually picks up John's marginalia habit.
Mm-hmm.
He was a very
Oh,
well-read
yeah.
man and, again, a very sensitive and intelligent person,
Mm-hmm.
but probably couldn't endure the
Mm-hmm.
pressure of his father, unfortunately. Had a little bit more of the, personality of his mother, the
Mm-hmm.
sensitive side, and, unfortunately died a tragic
Mm-hmm.
death of suicide,
Yes.
and,
Yeah. There's
and
great tragedy. You mentioned the courage, but the family also endures tremendous tragedy. You have
it sure
um,
does.
both John Adams and John Quincy Adams have sons who will die either from alcoholism or suicide, and then
Right.
Charles Francis, I believe, is the only one of the children of
Of
Louisa and John Quincy who survives into actually
right.
survives his parents. So, which is why
Right.
they have nieces living with them and grandchildren living with them at the old
Exactly,
house. Yeah.
exactly. Yeah. There is a lot of tragedy, it goes back to well, Abigail, of course, lost, um, a young child,
Hmm.
early in their life. She also writes to him poignantly about a stillborn birth, which
Hmm.
is just
Oh,
wrenches
yeah.
your heart.
Yes.
And then, of course, they lose Nabby.
Hmm.
And just actually next week will be the anniversary of John Quincy Adams and Louisa Catherine, who lost their year-old
Yeah.
daughter in St.
Yeah.
Petersburg.
Yes.
And again, that's one of those
Mm-hmm.
tragedies.
Mm-hmm.
At that time in her life, being so isolated,
Yes.
this little girl brought so
Hmm.
much
Oh,
joy to
yes.
their lives, and of course
Hmm.
they lose her, and then they have to leave her behind. So
Yes.
actually, um, just so that people know, there has been a history of Russians and Americans that have always maintained her grave
Hmm.
and have kept it up and maintain a correspondence with us so
Oh,
that
wow.
her life and legacy, lives on. So it's always a nice connection to have
Yes.
in another
It's
country.
amazing. It really is. It really is. I mean, because they do have, it's a story, you're in a farmhouse in Quincy and it seems an isolated place, but they're actually all over the world there.
Exactly. Exactly.
And the books
Yeah.
in the Stone Library are in a number of different languages too.
Right. Oh, yes. I think we have over 12 different languages represented.
Hmm.
Many books were gifts to the president, and but he could, of course, read and write in at least
Hmm.
7 different
Yeah.
languages. So we have everything from dictionaries and concordances and literature and history
Mm.
books that
Yes. Yeah.
is amazing.
Yeah. Now, Kelly, you've been at the Adams House long enough to have seen an impact from the work of David McCullough and the miniseries that drew a lot of attention to the Adamses. So, was there a big change? Has there been an impact from people
Oh,
now knowing more
absolutely.
about them?
Absolutely. Well, I hate to date myself, but when I actually started here, we actually had the impact of Paul Nagel's Descent from Glory. So we went from a site that had very, very few, probably visitors in the hundreds to then visitors in the thousands. And he really did,
Hmm.
break the story
Wow.
in the 20th century
Hmm.
mindset anyway. And fortunately, he broke the story of all 4 generations, which is even more interesting. But then,
Right.
the impact
Yes.
of McCullough's book and bringing John Adams alive, bringing the correspondence to people and the significance of that
Hmm.
correspondence. And again, just back to the birthplaces, um, that's where Abigail was just, writing furiously to her husband, supporting him, telling him the news of the
Hmm.
day, keeping him informed of everything. But then, what I think is so fascinating, it was many times ciphered because at any time their letters could
Hmm.
be intercepted and published by enemies or read
Hmm.
by uh, enemies on either side of the Atlantic. And so
Hmm.
I can't imagine, some of the heart-wrenching information and messages that they had to communicate to each other um,
Hmm.
were being sent, but then at the same time, also keeping that awareness that it could be on the front and center of the stage, at any time too.
Hmm.
So um, amazing, amazing what they
Yeah. It
pulled
really is. It
off.
really is. It is. So we're talking with Kelly Cobble, the curator at the Adams National Historical Site in Quincy. Now, the old houses are now open, or no, I'm sorry, the
The
birthplaces are
birthplaces,
now
right,
open, so
right.
visitors can come and visit.
Yes, yes. So we have a Wednesday through Sundays. We have rangers on site, so they
Hmm.
can, take people, show them around, talk to them about on the grounds, but then bring them through the
Yes.
houses. And then we do also on same days have rangers at Peacefield just to take them on a
Hmm.
tour of the grounds. And again, you can talk
Oh, yeah.
about the growth of the old house. It went from 7 rooms to 21 rooms over 100 years,
Mm-hmm.
and you can see the impact of it. And we talk about how it was a working farm with fruit trees, is what
Hmm.
really attracted John and Abigail to the property, to
Hmm.
now a 19th century sculpted, garden. So with
Yes.
magnificent buildings that you can only see from the outside.
Hmm. Well, now hopefully next year we'll be able to go inside again. And,
Sure, sure.
yeah.
And we are,
Good.
cognizant
Yes.
of how we can really do business from this point forward. So
Mm.
um, it's
Mm.
been tough not to have people come through the old house, but we're also
Oh,
gave
yeah.
us time
Yeah.
to shore up. We did get to do some good work in the house, um, you know, cleaning up some wallpaper and some of the painting that had to get done, some of the things that you just can't do in the winter months when we're usually closed.
Right.
So hopefully we'll be
Yes.
able to undo a little
Good.
bit of the impact that we've gone through since John Adams hit the big screen. So we're looking good
Yes.
for
Yeah.
2022.
Good. Very good. 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 So Quincy is a great city. It has a lot of history in it tied to the Adamses and, of course, Josiah Quincy and John Hancock. And I know Quincy has been doing a lot to celebrate its history and promote its
Sure.
history. So, so
Yeah. I would be.
my wife, by the way, grew up in Quincy.
We love it. We love that you have a connection
So
to
yeah,
us, and we always get to draw you back in.
yeah,
Yes,
that's right.
I
Yeah,
would be
I'll never
remiss.
be that far away.
The church is actually open as well for tours, and that's really
Oh,
important because
good.
that is the resting home of both presidents and their wives, and they do a terrific job giving tours. So they're open actually every day except for Wednesday. And I tell everybody, I encourage everybody to go to the Hancock Cemetery because that's where we do
Mm-hmm.
have John Adams's ancestors. We have the original Adamses that came over from England. We have John's parents, and then we have his peers, Josiah Quincy,
Mm-hmm.
the Basses, so many people that, of course, David wrote about, and some of the people
Yes.
that supported John throughout his
Mm-hmm.
lifetime. And so it's a lovely, quaint little cemetery to walk through and
Mm-hmm.
to get to know a little bit more about
Yeah.
the history that we have here.
Right. And it is right in the heart of downtown Quincy, this
Hmm.
quaint little
Hmm.
cemetery, which is, yes.
It's right
Good.
between
Well,
our bookends. So we have the birthplace is on one side, and then Peacefield is just about a half, but
mm,
both of them about a half mile from the center of town. So if people do come, we've been telling them we don't have our trolleys operating. So people that come
mhm,
by tea, we suggest they go to the Quincy Adams station and they can walk just about less than 10 minutes to the
mhm,
birthplaces. And then the Quincy Center station is just, again, that's where the church and the cemetery
mhm,
are. And then just about a 15-minute walk to Peacefield and the old house.
mhm. And well worth doing. We've been talking with Kelly Cobble, who is the curator of the Adams National Historical Site. Thank you for joining us, Kelly. And
My pleasure.
thank you, everyone, for joining us. And now we will be piped out on the road to Boston.